Hi, everybody. We are going to go through victimization at school and work. So, school victimization is any victimization that takes place of a child that's going to be on school grounds, on the school bus, during school activities, or while participating in a school function. Schools are mostly safe places, much despite what we see in the media. So when there's a school shooting or when there's a school incident, we see a 24/7 news cycle where we're really inundated with the story over and over and over, which makes it seem like it's much more pervasive than it is. And happily, and it's a really good thing. Statistically speaking, school shootings are actually very rare, and school crime that is violent is very rare. On average, 2% of all students are going to be victimized through school annually, and 1% of those are going to be victimized with theft, and the other 1% are going to be victimized with a violent crime. Violent crime victimization is most common in high school, grades 9 through 12. It's far less common in middle school, and obviously, thankfully, far less common in elementary school. Both violent death and suicide are rare in school settings. They do happen, but thankfully, they are very uncommon events. But like I said, when they do happen, they garner a lot of long-term attention from the media, which makes it appear like it's a greater problem than it is. Males are more likely than females to fall victim to violence in schools, and the younger years in high school. So the earlier you are in high school, the more likely you are to fall victim to violence. So ninth and 10th grade, you're going to fall victim to you're at greater risk than were you in 11th or 12th grade. It's very rare that teachers fall victim to violence. It does happen. It tends to happen in school shootings. It tends to happen in urban schools that have violence issues. But again, it's extraordinarily rare. About 5% of teachers report ever having been physically victimized by any students. Bullying is largely the etiology of most of school violence that we see. Bullying is going to be defined as the intentional abuse of a victim to provide them with consistent discomfort over time, where there's a power imbalance between the perpetrator and the victim, right? So obviously, the bully is going to be the one who is socially and behaviorally dominant over the person who is being victimized by the bullying behavior. There are multiple categories of bullying. So there's direct bullying, which is going to be both physical and verbal. There's physical bullying, which is going to be the hitting, shoving, punching, kicking, fighting, etc. Verbal bullying is going to be name calling, harassing, threatening, physical violence. And then there's indirect bullying, which is a more passive approach. It's going to be things like making hand gestures, socially isolating and blackballing people, ostracizing kids, manipulating kids and using them, things of that nature. Bullying is very common. 20% of all youth report having been bullied. Girls are more likely than boys to be bullied. Gay youth are more likely to be bullied than heterosexual youth. And youth who are bullied tend to be more passive in personality, which gets back to the idea of that power imbalance. That when you've got a more dominant personality, they're going to seek out somebody who's more of an introvert or who is more passive in order to dominate them and to victimize them. There is also a subset of individuals where the bullied become the bully, right? And that this is not enough. This is a thing that we see with a subset of people who are bullied, that they're not just on the receiving end of victimization over time. They do receive that victimization, but their reaction to it is to become aggressive and to start bullying others. Um, we see a lot of different outcomes with youth who have been bullied. We see depression, we see anxiety, we see lower self-esteem, both in their school life and later as they grow up to be adults. So this has long-term effects. Like I said, some victims will respond by bullying and acting out violently or aggressively. Largely, when we see a school shooting, we usually see a history of bullying in the school shooter. That does not at all excuse that level of carnage, but we do see that it is a problem, and there's a lot of room for improvement with the way our schools manage and intervene to make sure that that bullying never escalates to violence and certainly never escalates to school shootings. The introduction of technology has made bullying more pervasive, and it's created a farther reach. Before technology, bullying largely happened at school, and then you went home and things were done. But now everybody has cell phones, and they have the internet, and they have text messaging, and they have social media, and bullying has proliferated to all of those outlets, which makes it more intense than we've ever seen it throughout history, right? Because kids can't get away from it. Like I said, technology. So cyberbullying is going to be using that technology, cell phones, internet, etc., to threaten, harass, humiliate, etc. kids. Part of a reaction to this issue that we see is some legislation called the Gun-Free Schools Act of 2004, which instituted a policy of a 1-year suspension for any child who brings a firearm into a school zone. And this is an attempt to keep school shootings from happening and to identify them beforehand. Other schools, many schools have also instituted zero tolerance policies where all individuals who engage in a fight will be punished. That includes the person who's on the receiving end. This can be very controversial because it sort of begs the question, well, if somebody instigates a fight with me, what am I supposed to stand there and let them beat the hell out of me so I don't get in trouble? That's not totally a fair expectation of the person who is on the receiving end of the beating, that, you will get in trouble too. But the zero tolerance policy is supposed to keep everybody at bay in terms of aggression and physical violence. Peer mediation is also a reaction, and this is an approach to bullying where peers are trained in conflict resolution, where they sit down with the bully and the person being bullied, and they try to mediate and create an amicable solution where the bullying stops and the two people, just go their separate ways. We talked about school shootings. They have been on the rise in recent decades. Like I said, though, it is still a very, very rare event, but they do receive a lot of media violence. And school shootings have not just been limited to high schools. We've also seen them bleed over into college campuses. And college campuses, similar to high school campuses, are relatively safe with the exception of one area of crime. That area of crime is going to be sexual assault. There is a problem with sexual assault on college and university campuses, which we've talked about in previous chapters, due to the age group, due to the high rates of drug and alcohol use, due to the ease of victimization. But aside from sexual assault, there's a lack of violence on campuses. Regardless of this, it doesn't mean there's no violence ever on campuses, which introduces us to the Clery Act. And the Clery Act directly approaches this issue of violence on campuses. There was a young college co-ed named Jean Clery. She was a female college student at Lehigh Valley College. She was violently raped and murdered. And her parents, after her death, created this legislation called the Clery Act, which mandates that all colleges and universities disclose and collect and disclose data on victimization. Part of the reason for this response was that this woman's victimizer was able to access her dorm very easily because not only was the door unlocked, but the door was propped open presumably to allow airflow in on a warm night. He just walked right into the building, walked into her dorm, raped her, killed her, and walked right back out. And this unfortunate incident of victimization really brought a microscope on college and university campuses to say, what are you doing to keep your students safe so that things like this, though they are rare, don't happen again in the future? And so now we have the Clery Act so that when people are looking at a prospective college or university, they can request this data and say, before I make this decision, is this campus safe for me to attend, for my child to attend? Let's switch gears here and talk about victimization in the workplace. This is going to be any kind of victimization that takes place while somebody's at work. There are a multitude of categories of workplace victimization. So the first is going to be criminal intent incidents. And that's where the person who is doing the criminalization, who's creating the victimization, they don't actually work in that workplace, right? They don't have any legitimate reason to be at that workplace or that business where the victimization is taking place. So an example of this would be like someone who robs a gas station and shoots a gas station attendant. The victim is at work. It is, violence in their workplace. But the perpetrator really has nothing to do with the perpetrator doesn't work there. They're there just to engage in victimization. There's also customer-client incidents of workplace violence, and this is where there's going to be a relationship between the workplace and the client. So the client is somebody who's paying for some kind of service or some kind of deliverable, and they're unhappy, and they escalate that unhappiness into violence that is retaliatory against that workplace. Worker-on-worker incidents are more common. We hear a lot about these in the media, and this is where an individual has a conflict with a fellow colleague or with a boss and lashes out, and it escalates into violence. This is that very archetypal perspective of workplace violence that we call, going postal, where somebody's unhappy in the workplace and eventually they just snap and they get into physical altercations, or they come in and they shoot up the workplace. That would be worker-on-worker incidents. There's also personal relationship incidents, and that's where the offender has a personal relationship with somebody in the workplace and engages in violence in their workplace. They don't necessarily work there, right? But an intimate partner works there, right? Somebody who's breaking up with them, somebody who's divorcing them. And so they go to the workplace to harm that individual or to kill that individual in the workplace. Occupations have greater risk of victimization than others. I just want you to know that there are, the most likely occupations where victimization are going to result for the people working in those occupations obviously are going to be law enforcement, which is high risk physically already. Retail workers, because people get very unhappy with, in retail situations, and also they just sort of provide a fertile breeding ground. So liquor stores, jewelry stores, all of those places, there's going to be a higher rate of victimization because there are valuables there, right? So people come to rob those stores, and when stores are robbed, people are more likely to get hurt in the workplace. People who work in the mental health industry are more likely to sustain injury due to people with mental health conditions lashing out, getting violent, etc. Gas station workers are, commonly victimized because they work independently. They work often late hours in complete isolation. It's just them and the people who come in, the few people who come in. So they're at great risk for violence in the workplace. And finally, special education teachers have a high rate of reported assaults against them from students. Taxi cab drivers, which, fast forward to 2024, this is going to translate into ride share drivers because we don't really have taxi cabs anymore. But ride share drivers are at the greatest risk of falling victim to murder. Again, because of the isolated nature of their work, it's very easy to victimize them violently in a sort of private capacity. And they're followed by law enforcement officers, are most likely to be killed while they're in the workplace. The following list that I'm going to provide you are all risk factors that increase the likelihood that if you work there, that you will fall victim to workplace violence. So anybody who works with money obviously is going to be vulnerable because people are going to try and rob you. Robberies get physical, robberies end in homicide. Working with very few people or working alone, you're isolated. It makes you a better target for workplace violence. Working at late at night or very early in the morning when the bulk of the world is sleeping, which means there's very little guardianship, right? There's very few. Most people are at home sleeping. Not a lot of people are in your workplace or in the parking lot when you're going to your car into work or home from work, which again gives you an isolation capacity that makes you vulnerable. Any kind of work in high crime areas, working with delivery passengers or goods. Again, there's the isolation that you're sort of in this you're isolated in this moving workplace, an automobile of some kind. And certainly if you are delivering goods, you're at high risk of robbery. And finally, guarding valuable property. It's not uncommon from time to time to hear people who drive armored trucks, who do cash pickups from businesses, from banks, etc., to get robbed and to be murdered in the process of that robbery. So the way we look at prevention for workplace violence is going to be environmental design, right? Making it harder for people to get into the workplace that can come here and harm it. So, a lot of workplaces will have locked doors. Only the people who work there with badges can access and get in. Even then, they'll often have sort of vestibules that if you don't work here, okay, you can come in, but you have to stay in this vestibule before we let you over here and, where the workers are. Behavioral strategies are a big one. So if someone in the workplace is showing agitation, if they're talking about violence, if they're talking about weapons, identifying that, contacting somebody in the workplace, escalating the identification of this talk to make sure that you can stop, a violent incident before it occurs. And then finally, more and more workplaces are, incorporating workplace violence training, how to respond, how to recognize it, and more places are incorporating workplace responses to active shooters, what to do in the face of an active shooting, how to hide, how to barricade, how to flee, what to do if none of those are an option and you're faced with the shooter. And all of these are an attempt to empower people to not just be sort of sitting ducks at work, waiting to be harmed.